The Las Vegas Monorail opened on July 15, 2004, connecting 7 casino hotels along the eastern side of the Las Vegas Strip, from the MGM Grand at the southern end to the Sahara Hotel at the northern end, a distance of approximately 4 miles, served by 7 stations in a journey, whose total end-to-end travel time was approximately 14 minutes. The system was developed as a private enterprise, financed through approximately $650 million in tax-exempt private activity bonds issued under the assumption that the monorail would attract sufficient ridership to generate the fare revenue and advertising income necessary to service the bond obligations. The ridership projections that justified the $650 million in bond financing estimated that the system would carry approximately 19 to 20 million annual riders by its 3rd year of operation. The system carried approximately 4 million riders in its first full year. The Las Vegas Monorail filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on January 13, 2010, citing its inability to service the bond debt from the fare and advertising revenue the system was generating. The forensic entry point for this case is the specific mechanism by which a transportation project's ridership projection can diverge from its actual performance by a factor of approximately 5, and what that divergence reveals about the institutional processes that validate transportation infrastructure investment decisions and the incentive structures that produce optimistic projections rather than accurate ones. 20 million annual riders was not a conservative projection. It was not a realistic projection. It was a projection calibrated to the financing requirement rather than to the transportation demand that the system's design, location, and competitive positioning were capable of generating. That calibration, from required revenue backward to required ridership rather than from available demand forward to achievable revenue, is the specific analytical failure that this case documents, and it is a failure mode that is significantly more common in transportation infrastructure finance than the frequency of documented cases suggests. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. The Las Vegas Monorail's ridership projection failure was not primarily a failure of transportation demand modeling. It was a failure of competitive positioning analysis. The monorail's design had 2 specific characteristics that the ridership projections had not adequately priced as competitive disadvantages relative to the alternatives available to Strip visitors. The first was the monorail's location on the eastern side of the Strip, running behind the casino hotels rather than along the street frontage of Las Vegas Boulevard. A visitor standing on Las Vegas Boulevard, which is where the Strip's pedestrian traffic is concentrated, cannot see the monorail or directly access any of its stations without walking through a casino hotel or using a designated pedestrian access route that is not visible from the street. This geographic characteristic meant that the monorail was not competing primarily with the Las Vegas Boulevard itself, the most walkable and visually engaging pedestrian environment in the American entertainment industry, but with the interior casino connections and the taxi and rideshare services that Strip visitors used when they did not want to walk. The second was the monorail's pricing relative to its competitive alternatives. The base fare for a monorail ride was initially set at $5 per trip, a price that, relative to the cost of a taxi between the same destinations, was not sufficiently compelling to drive the mode shift from taxi to monorail that the ridership projection required. The covenant that the monorail's bond financing did not read carefully enough was the one written into the competitive transportation economics of a Strip visitor who had the choice between a visible, accessible, free-to-walk Las Vegas Boulevard and an invisible, access-challenged monorail at $5 per trip. The 20 million annual riders projection required a substantial proportion of Strip visitors to choose the monorail over walking or taxi for trips that the monorail's location and pricing made less convenient and less economical than the alternatives. The actual ridership demonstrated that Strip visitors consistently preferred the alternatives, not because the monorail was poorly operated, but because the alternatives were genuinely superior for the trip categories that the monorail was designed to serve. At what point does a transportation infrastructure project's ridership projection need to be validated against the behavioral economics of its competitive alternatives? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology that produced the 20 million annual riders projection for the Las Vegas Monorail reflected a pattern documented across transportation infrastructure finance, the treatment of captured demand as additive demand, and the underpricing of competitive substitution. Captured demand in transportation infrastructure analysis refers to the trips that would be made on the new system, because the new system serves a route or a market that the existing system does not serve and that the traveler genuinely wants to make. Additive demand refers to the incremental trips generated by the new system's existence that would not have occurred without the system, because the system makes a trip convenient that was previously inconvenient enough to deter it. The monorail's ridership projection treated a substantial portion of its projected ridership as additive demand, assuming that the monorail's availability would generate strip trips that would not have occurred without it. The actual ridership pattern documented that the monorail primarily served the substitution market, capturing travelers who were switching from walking or taxi, and that the substitution rate was significantly lower than the projection had assumed because the competitive alternatives were more attractive than the projection had modeled. The bond rating agencies that assigned investment-grade ratings to the monorail bonds accepted the ridership projections without conducting independent analysis of the competitive transportation economics that would have identified the projection's primary vulnerability. The acceptance of optimistic ridership projections by rating agencies and institutional investors in transportation infrastructure finance is a systemic characteristic of the sector, not an anomaly specific to the Las Vegas Monorail, because the incentive structures of every party in the transaction, the developer, the underwriter, the rating agency, and the institutional investor, reward deal completion rather than deal accuracy and do not impose proportionate penalties for optimistic projections that subsequently prove incorrect. The Las Vegas Monorail's projection was more aggressively optimistic than the sector's typical overestimation, but the mechanism that produced the overestimation was the same mechanism documented in transportation infrastructure finance across the country. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The Las Vegas Monorail's bankruptcy filing of January 2010 produced a restructuring that reduced the system's bond obligations to a level that the actual ridership revenue could service. The restructured system has operated continuously since then, carrying between 4 and 6 million annual passengers and generating the fare and advertising revenue that the restructured debt requires. The monorail continues to serve its 7 stations along the Eastern Strip, connecting the same casino hotels it connected at opening on the same route at adjusted fare levels that the competitive economics of the Las Vegas transportation market have shaped across the years since the bankruptcy. The institutional consequences of the ridership projection failure extended beyond the monorail's individual bond market. The Las Vegas Monorail case has been cited in transportation finance academic literature and regulatory discussions as a documented example of the systematic optimism bias that characterizes ridership projections in transportation infrastructure finance, a bias whose sources have been analyzed across hundreds of global transportation projects and whose persistence, despite documented evidence, reflects the incentive structures that transportation infrastructure development creates rather than any deficit of analytical capability. What the Las Vegas Monorail case reveals in the context of this channel's 53-case archive is the specific category of institutional failure that transportation infrastructure optimism bias produces. A financing structure assembled around a ridership projection that was calibrated to the financial requirement rather than to the transportation demand, validated by an institutional chain that relied on sequential acceptance rather than independent analysis, and producing a bankruptcy that the actual ridership's revenue could not have prevented, because the financing structure had been sized to a demand that was never available to be captured. The 20 million annual riders were not lost to poor service or poor marketing. They were never there to be lost. The projection had created them in the spreadsheet, and the bond market had financed them. The Strip visitors chose to walk. If this case file changed how you evaluate the relationship between ridership projections and transportation infrastructure financing. Subscribe, because the next case examines a developer whose projections were applied to real estate rather than transportation, and whose failure followed the same institutional validation chain. And in the comments, given the documented systematic optimism bias in transportation infrastructure ridership projections, what specific independent validation requirement should be mandatory for any private activity? Bond financing, whose debt service depends on ridership projections that exceed documented comparable system performance by more than 25%. The case file is open. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication. Factual claims, interpretive framing, creative direction, and final content decisions reflect human judgment throughout. This disclosure is provided in accordance with platform transparency standards for AI-assisted content.